Elizabeth Holmes stood in front of investors wearing her black turtleneck, eyes unblinking, voice unnaturally deep. She quoted an ancient Chinese text like it was scripture. Appear weak when you are strong. Strong when you are weak. She had no technology, no working prototype, no breakthrough. Just a blood testing company valued at $9 billion built entirely on deception. When the fraud collapsed, prosecutors found something disturbing in her notes. She hadn't just read Sun Tzu's Art of War, she had weaponized it. And she had missed the one principle that separates strategy from fraud. Here's what nobody tells you about that 2,500-year-old book. It wasn't written to help you win. It was written to make you think differently about what winning even means, and that people who misunderstand that difference end up in prison, or worse, they end up teaching it to others. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The art of war is still being used on you, right now, in ways you've been trained not to see. The year is 1972. Archaeologists in China crack open a tomb sealed for over 2,000 years. Inside, bamboo strips covered in ancient text. But this wasn't just one book, it was two. The first was written by Sun Wu, the man we call Sun Tzu. The second was written by someone named Sun Bin. And for centuries, historians had confused them. They thought these were the same person. This discovery did something historians hate to admit. It proved that what we'd been calling history was actually guesswork. The art of war we'd been studying, we had no idea who really wrote it when it was compiled, or whether the stories about its author were even real. Here's what we know now. The text likely came together between 400 and 320 BC, during a period of Chinese history so violent it's still hard to comprehend. The Spring and Autumn period. Not the Warring States era most people mention. That came later. This was earlier, more chaotic. A time when war wasn't a political tool, it was an aristocratic sport. Nobles would send armies to fight like it was a tournament. There were rules. You didn't attack during meals. You didn't use certain tactics because they weren't honorable. Battles lasted for months. Thousands died. Entire regions were destroyed. And at the end, everyone lost. Then comes this text. 13 chapters. Around 6,000 Chinese characters. You could read the whole thing in under an hour. And it said something nobody in power wanted to hear. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Wait. A war manual that tells you not to fight? That's not a contradiction. That's the entire point. Because Sun Tzu wasn't interested in battles. He was interested in what happens inside your opponent's mind before the battle even begins. And if you can control that, you don't need soldiers. You don't need weapons. You just need them to defeat themselves. This idea didn't come from military tradition. It came from somewhere else entirely. Three competing philosophies were tearing through China at the time, and Sun Tzu synthesized all of them into something new. The first was Confucianism. It said leaders should be moral, virtuous, that even in war, you maintain ethical conduct. That self-knowledge comes from self-cultivation. Know yourself isn't a military tactic in Confucianism. It's a spiritual discipline. The second was Taoism. It taught Wu Wei, non-action, flow like water. Don't fight the rock, go around it. Be formless. Adapt to whatever shape the situation demands. Winning without fighting is pure Taoist thought. It's not about avoiding conflict. It's about making conflict unnecessary. The third was legalism, brutal, unforgiving. It said human nature is selfish and needs to be controlled through harsh laws and swift punishment. Discipline isn't optional. Incompetence isn't tolerated. The Qin dynasty later used legalism to unify China in 221 BC through sheer terror and efficiency. Sun Tzu took all three and built something terrifying. The moral self-awareness of Confucianism, the adaptive formlessness of Taoism, the ruthless discipline of legalism. And he aimed it at one target: your opponent's perception of reality. Because here's what modern neuroscience has confirmed about that ancient insight. Your brain doesn't see reality. Apple was 3 years ahead of everyone. That's strategic deception, hiding real strength until the moment of maximum impact. Compare that to WeWork, appeared to be a revolutionary tech company while actually being a real estate sublease operation bleeding money, valued at $47 billion, then bankruptcy. That's not deception, that's delusion. But here's the question nobody's asking. If this principle is so easy to misunderstand, if it's so easy to cross the line from strategy into fraud, why is it still being taught in business schools? Why is it required reading at West Point? Why do CEOs and generals and political operatives keep coming back to a text written 2,500 years ago? The answer is uncomfortable. Because it still works. Not the way most people think. Not as a list of tactics to copy. But as a way of seeing through the surface of competition to the psychological machinery underneath. And once you see that machinery, you start noticing it everywhere. In how countries position themselves. In how companies launch products. In how information is controlled. You start seeing the pattern, and the pattern is always the same. Control perception, disrupt orientation, force mistakes, win before anyone realizes the game has started. That's not ancient wisdom, that's the operating system still running underneath the modern world, and most people don't even know it's there. The year is 1966. An American fighter pilot named John Boyd is obsessed with a problem nobody else thinks is a problem. Soviet MiG fighters are shooting down American F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam, and it makes no sense. The American planes are bigger, more expensive, more powerful. They carry more weapons. They have better radar. On paper, it's not even a contest. But in the air, American pilots are dying. Boyd starts studying why, and he finds something that breaks every assumption the Pentagon had about air combat. The Soviet planes are lighter, faster to turn, more maneuverable. And that means Soviet pilots can make decisions faster. They can observe what's happening, process it, decide on a response, and act before the American pilot has even finished thinking. Boyd calls this the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. But here's what makes Boyd different from every other military theorist. He doesn't stop there. He goes looking for where this idea came from. And he finds it in an ancient Chinese text he'd read 7 times. He owned 7 different annotated copies of The Art of War. Because he knew Sun Tzu had figured out something 2,500 years ago that modern air combat was only now proving. Speed doesn't mean moving faster, it means thinking faster. And the most critical phase in that loop isn't observation or decision or action, it's orientation. That's where your brain makes sense of what you're seeing. That's where you build the model of reality you're going to act on. And if someone can scramble that phase, if they can feed you information that breaks your model, you'll make the wrong decision, even if you make it quickly. This is what Sun Tzu meant by deception. You're not lying to your enemy. You're destroying their ability to orient correctly. You're attacking the prediction engine in their brain. Boyd turned this insight into American military doctrine. It's how General Schwarzkopf planned the Gulf War in 1991. Move faster than Iraqi command could react. Get inside their OODA loop. By the time they observed what was happening and tried to orient to it, the situation had already changed. Their decisions were based on outdated models. And they lost before they understood what they were fighting. But here's where it gets darker. Because that same principle isn't just being used in warfare anymore, it's being used everywhere. And most people have no idea it's happening to them. Think about social media. You scroll through your feed, you see a post, your brain starts to orient. Is this true? Is this outrage justified? Should I share this? But before you finish processing, the next post appears. Then another, then another. You're stuck in a permanent observe phase. You never fully orient. You just react. That's not an accident. That's by design. The platform isn't giving you information. It's preventing you from making sense of information. Because an oriented user is a dangerous user. They might leave. They might think saying anything, you're not just deceiving people about a specific fact. You're teaching them that video evidence itself is unreliable, that seeing is no longer believing, that there is no objective truth anymore, only competing narratives. Sun Tzu wrote, "When capable, feign incapacity." But what happens when you can feign anything? When artificial intelligence can generate perfect imitations of reality? You get a world where the O'Day loop doesn't just slow down, it breaks completely, because the observe phase is corrupted. You can't orient to information if you can't trust that the information is real. This is the modern battlefield, and it's not in Ukraine or Taiwan or the South China Sea. It's in your phone, in your feed, in the invisible infrastructure of how information reaches you and how you make sense of it. Boyd understood this. He spent the last decades of his life warning that the real war wasn't about weapons. It was about what he called moral conflict. Not morality in the ethical sense, moral in the sense of morale, of will, of whether a population believes their system works, or whether they lose faith in the possibility of knowing what's true. And Sun Tzu predicted this too. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. You don't need to invade. You don't need to conquer. You just need to make them stop believing their system can protect them. Make them doubt their institutions, their media, their neighbors, themselves. Once that doubt is in place, they'll do the rest of the work for you. Now here's the question you need to sit with, and this is where it gets personal. Think about how you make decisions, about politics, about money, about who to trust. You think you're observing facts, orienting rationally, deciding freely, and acting independently. But how much of your orientation phase is actually controlled by algorithms you can't see, designed by people you'll never meet, optimized for outcomes you don't understand? How often are you stuck in the observe phase, consuming information without ever fully making sense of it? How many of your decisions are based on models of reality that someone else built for you? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is systems theory. You don't need a secret room of evil people pulling strings. You just need incentive structures that reward controlling attention and preventing orientation. You need platforms that profit from confusion. You need actors who understand that a population unable to orient is a population unable to resist. And here's the uncomfortable. Knowing yourself means understanding your own cognitive biases, your blind spots, the predictions your brain makes automatically that might be wrong, the confirmation bias that makes you seek information that agrees with what you already believe, the Dunning-Kruger effect that makes incompetent people think they're competent, the overconfidence that makes you ignore warning signs. Sun Tzu was influenced by Confucianism, and in Confucian thought, self-knowledge isn't intellectual. It's brutal honesty about where you're weak, about where you deceive yourself. It's the opposite of the self-help version of confidence. It's disciplined self-criticism. And knowing your enemy doesn't mean knowing their weapons or their troop strength. It means psychological profiling. What do they want? What do they fear? How do they think? What assumptions are they making that might be wrong? This is game theory before game theory existed. John von Neumann proved in 1928 that in zero-sum games, knowing what your opponent knows leads to stable outcomes. Nash proved that when both players understand each other's incentives, you get equilibrium. Sun Tzu figured this out 2,300 years earlier without mathematics. just by watching how human psychology works under pressure. And this is why the text survives, not because it has magical tactics, but because it maps something fundamental about how competition works when information is incomplete and deception is possible. But here's the thing about game theory that Sun Tzu also understood. It only works when the rules are clear and both sides are playing the same game. What happens when the rules keep changing? What happens when your enemy isn't a state with hierarchical command, but a decentralized network with no leadership? What happens when the game itself is the weapon? That's where Sun Tzu starts to fail, and that's what we need to talk about next. Afghanistan, August 15th, 2021. The most powerful military in human history withdraws from a country it occupied for 20 years. The Taliban retakes control in a matter of days. The United States military knows Sun Tzu better than almost any fighter. Pets.com raised $300 million and went from IPO to bankruptcy in 268 days. The strategy was pure speed. Dominate the market before anyone else can move. Blitz scaling. It's what Silicon Valley calls it now. Rapid expansion funded by venture capital betting on winner-take-all outcomes. Except Sun Tzu never said skip preparation. The actual principle was prepare thoroughly in secret, then strike with overwhelming speed when ready. The modern misreading is skip step 1, jump straight to step 2. Quibi, $1.75 billion raised, shut down in 6 months. FTX, $32 billion valuation, bankruptcy in days. WeWork. We already talked about WeWork. The pattern is the same. Confusing speed with strategy, movement with progress, growth with value. And when these companies collapse, the people running them often say the same thing. And we were moving too fast to see the problems. As if speed excuses incompetence. As if fail fast means don't think first. Sun Tzu would have seen this coming, because the original text says something most people skip over. Victorious warriors win first, then go to war. Defeated warriors go to war first, then seek to win. Meaning, the battle is decided before it begins, not by moving fast, by preparing completely. But here's the deeper failure, the one that's harder to talk about because it implicates the text itself. Sun Tzu treats deception as morally neutral, a tool, a tactic, something you use because it works. The philosophical framework is legalist, human nature is selfish, conflict is inevitable. Use whatever works to survive, but that framework doesn't account for something critical, the difference between strategic ambiguity and fraud, between competing and destroying, between winning and making sure everyone else loses. Theranos again. Elizabeth Holmes didn't just use deception strategically. She built an entire company on the idea that deception itself was the product, that appearing to have technology was the same as having technology, that fooling investors was the same as serving patients. And when the fraud collapsed, people died. Not metaphorically, literally. Patients got incorrect blood test results. They made medical decisions based on false information. Some delayed treatment. Some received wrong treatment. This is what happens when you strip strategy from ethics, when you take Sun Tzu's principles and remove the Confucian constraints that were supposed to balance them. Because Confucianism didn't just influence the text in the know yourself principle, it was supposed to be the moral guardrail. The idea that even in competition, you maintain integrity, that victory without virtue isn't victory at all, that the means matter as much as the ends. Modern business culture read Sun Tzu and kept the tactics. But it deleted the philosophy. It took the legalist ruthlessness and the Taoist adaptability, but it left behind the Confucian ethics. And the result is a system where deception is celebrated as long as you don't get caught. Where disruption means destroying industries without considering the human cost. Where winning means market dominance regardless of whether you created any actual value. This isn't Sun Tzu's fault, it's ours. For reading a text written in a specific philosophical and cultural context and applying it in a completely different context without asking if the transplant even makes sense. So here's the 50% question. The one that determines whether you're thinking clearly or just repeating patterns. Look at the systems you exist in, your workplace, your country's political structure, the platforms you use for information. Which model do they follow? Are they Confucian? Do they reward virtue, ethical behavior, long-term thinking, and restraint? Are they Taoist? Do they adapt, flow, avoid rigidity, change when evidence demands it? Or are they legalist? Do they enforce compliance through punishment, opacity, and fear? Do they assume the worst about human nature and design systems accordingly? Because here's what the last 20 years has shown us. In the West, we thought we were building Confucian systems, democratic institutions, rule of law, transparency, accountability, merit. But when you actually look at how power operates, we've built something much closer to legalism. Surveillance without clear rules, punishment without proportionality. Work in both systems, but they work better in legalist ones because they assume deception, information asymmetry, ruthless efficiency, the willingness to sacrifice ethics for outcomes. This is why the text survives, not because it's universal wisdom, but because it's optimized for exactly the kind of systems that emerge under pressure. And right now, we're under pressure. Climate change, pandemic, economic instability, political polarization. Technological disruption happening faster than institutions can adapt. Every one of these is a stress test. And stress tests reveal what systems are actually made of. So when you see governments expanding surveillance, justifying it with security, when you see platforms controlling information flow, justifying it with safety, when you see Do the thinking first, then execute faster than your opponent can react. Every business graveyard is filled with people who confuse Sun Tzu didn't write a book about war. He wrote a book about the psychology of conflict when information is incomplete and deception is possible. That applies to war, but it also applies to business, politics, relationships, your own decision-making process. The question isn't whether these principles work. They do. The question is what happens to a civilization when everyone knows them, when deception is expected, when trust becomes impossible because everyone's trying to get inside everyone else's OODA loop. Do we get better at seeing through deception, or do we just get better at deceiving? Do we build systems resilient to manipulation, or do we build systems optimized for it? Sun Tzu doesn't answer that, because Sun Tzu was writing for individuals trying to survive, not for civilizations trying to thrive. And that might be the most important thing to understand about the text. It's not a blueprint for how to build a society. It's a survival manual for how to operate when society is collapsing. The fact that we're still teaching it 2,500 years later might say more about where we are than where we're going. If this changed how you see power, competition, or the information you consume every day, share it. Not because I need the algorithm boost, but because the people who understand these patterns early have an advantage over the people who don't. And if you want to keep going deeper, if you want to understand how other ancient systems of power still control the modern world in ways you haven't noticed, this channel exists for exactly that. We're deconstructing Machiavelli next. The Prince. The book everyone thinks is about ruthless power, but when you actually read it in context, it's something much stranger. Subscribe if you want to be here for that. And comment with your answer to the 75% question. When pressure increases, which systems survive? The ones built on trust or the ones built on control? Because the answer to that question determines what world your children inherit.